Base station called Harmony Rest floated in the darkness between 3 star systems, and it was home to thousands of aliens from 17 different species. And tonight, something terrible was happening. Ambassador Vorthal woke up in the middle of the night cycle because something felt wrong, and he could not explain it, but his scales were cold and his 4 hearts were beating too fast, and he walked to his daughter's sleeping pod and found it empty. He searched the entire quarters and called her name, but she was gone, and there was no sign of struggle, and no broken locks, and no alarms, and it was like she had simply vanished into thin air. Vorthal ran into the corridor and found he was not alone because other parents were also searching and also screaming and also crying in their own species way, and the hallway was full of panic. Chief Medical Officer Kessath was a Vorn, which meant she had gray skin and 8 eyes and 4 children, and all 4 of her nests were empty now, and she made a sound that no translator could handle because it was pure grief. The station AI announced an emergency, and within minutes, everyone knew the truth, and it was worse than anyone could imagine, because every single child on the station was gone, and 43 cubs from 17 species had disappeared in one night. The adults gathered in the central hub, and they looked at each other with fear and with suspicion, because someone had to be responsible, and someone had to pay Ambassador. Vorthal pointed at the Vorn delegation, and his voice was sharp like broken glass, and he said that perhaps the Vorn had taken the children for their experiments, because everyone knew the Vorn studied genetics. Kessath rose to her full height, and her 8 eyes burned with anger, and she said that perhaps the Krethians had sold the children to slavers, because everyone knew the Krethians valued profit above honor. The silicates, who were made of living crystal, suggested that the Meridians were responsible because the Meridians were predators, and perhaps they had gotten hungry. The Meridians growled and showed their teeth, and said that at least they did not eat their own young like some species they could mention. The accusations flew back and forth like weapons, and old hatreds came back to life, and species that had been at peace for centuries now looked at each other like enemies. Someone in the back mentioned the humans, but the idea was dismissed almost immediately because everyone knew humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, and they were too primitive and too weak and too few to pull off something like this. There were only 3 humans on the entire station, and they had no technology and no allies and no reason to steal children. And besides, what would humans even do with alien cubs? Commander Rilix was a tall being with silver skin and no mouth, who communicated through vibrations in the air, and she called for order and demanded that everyone calm down. But nobody was listening. Parents were crying and threatening, and some were already arming themselves, and the station that had been built for peace was now on the edge of war. The security team searched every deck and every room and every cargo bay, and they found nothing, and the children were simply gone, and the sensors showed no unauthorized ships leaving, and no life signs in the escape pods, and no evidence of any kind. Hours passed, and hope began to die, and the parents started to imagine the worst, and some of them fell silent, and some of them screamed, and some of them just sat on the floor and stared at nothing. The 3 humans on the station offered to help search, and they were assigned to the lower decks, where nobody else wanted to go, because the gravity was unstable, and the air was thin, and the lights flickered like dying stars. Chief Engineer Marcus Webb and botanist Dr. Amara Alconquo and cultural liaison James Chun took their flashlights and went down into the darkness while everyone else continued to fight. Nobody noticed that James Chun did not seem surprised, and nobody noticed that he knew exactly where he was going, and nobody noticed the small smile on his face, because nobody was watching the humans. They never did. The station had become a place of madness and fear, and the corridors that once echoed with laughter now echoed with accusations and threats and the sound of parents. Losing hope, Commander Eurilix ordered a deck-by-deck sweep, and every security officer on the station was deployed, and they searched through cargo bays and maintenance tunnels and storage rooms, and they found nothing. The Krethian soldiers moved in tight formations with their weapons drawn, and they kicked open doors and scanned every shadow, and they were looking for enemies because that was what they knew how to do. The Vorn medical teams set up emergency stations and prepared for the worst. And they had equipment ready for 43 young bodies, and nobody wanted to say what they were really preparing for. Silicates spread through the station like a living network, and they pressed their crystal bodies against walls and floors and tried to feel vibrations that might lead them to the children. The Meridians used their hunting instincts and their sharp noses, and they tracked scents through ventilation shafts, and they growled at anyone who got in their way, but nobody found anything, and the children had vanished like ghosts down in the lower decks. The three humans moved through darkness, and their flashlights cut through the gloom like tiny suns, and Marcus Webb complained about the gravity fluctuations, and Amara Okonkwo watched her breath fog in the cold air. James Chun walked ahead of them, and he seemed to know where he was going, and his two colleagues did not question it because humans trusted each other in ways that other species found strange. The lower decks were old and forgotten, and most species avoided them because the life support was unreliable, and the corridors were narrow, and the ghosts of failed experiments lingered in the recycled air. But James kept walking, and his footsteps were steady and confident, and Marcus and Amara followed because that was what humans did when one of their own took the lead back in the upper decks. The situation was getting worse, and Ambassador Vorthal had armed his personal guard, and Chief Medical Officer Tessic had called for Vorn reinforcements, and the Marine pack leaders were sharpening their claws. Commander Rilix tried to maintain order, but she was losing control, and the station that had taken decades to build was falling apart in a single night. Then something happened that changed everything. A Meridian tracker named Cross picked up a strange signal on his scanner, and at first he thought it was a malfunction because the reading made no sense, and it showed dozens of biosigns clustered together in Section 7 Gamma. Section 7 Gamma was the old hydroponics bay that had been shut down years ago, and nobody went there anymore because the plants had died and the equipment had failed, and there was nothing there but empty tanks and broken dreams. But the scanner was showing life signs, and not just a few but many, and they were small and they were calm, and they were all showing the biological patterns of deep restful sleep. Cross reported his findings, and within minutes the news spread through the station, and parents who had been fighting suddenly stopped, and parents who had been crying suddenly looked up, and everyone started moving towards Section 7 Gamma. The security teams formed up, and they armed their weapons, and they prepared for combat because this could be a trap, and whoever had taken the children might be waiting. Commander Rilix took personal command, and she led the advance through the narrow corridors, and the emergency lights cast red shadows on the walls, and everyone was silent and tense. They reached the doors of the old hydroponics bay, and the doors were sealed but not locked, and someone had recently used power to activate the environmental systems, and the air coming through the vents was warm and clean. Rilix gave the signal, and the doors opened, and the security teams rushed in with weapons raised, and they were ready for anything except what they actually found. Weapons slowly lowered, and the fierce warriors became silent, and somewhere behind them a parent made a sound of pure relief because the children were there, and they were safe, and they were sleeping, and they were not alone. And sitting in the middle of all those sleeping cubs was a human named James Chun. The old hydroponics bay had been transformed, and the security teams stood frozen at the entrance because none of them could understand what they were seeing. The broken equipment was gone, and in its place were soft glowing plants that cast gentle blue and green light across the room, and the light moved slowly like waves on a peaceful ocean. The temperature was perfect, and not too hot and not too cold, and somehow the environmental systems had been calibrated to create a median that worked for all 17 species at once, and that should have been impossible. The floor was covered with improvised bedding made from thermal blankets and cushioning foam and spare fabric from the cargo bays, and it looked like a nest, but a nest big enough for dozens of children. And there they were, 43 cubs from 17 different worlds were sleeping together in one great pile of peace and contentment, and their breathing was slow, and their bodies were relaxed, and they looked safer than they had ever looked in their lives. A Krethian child with green scales was curled against a Lorn hatchling with gray skin and egg-closed eyes, and their bodies rose and fell together as they breathed. The silicate younglings had dimmed their crystal bodies to their rest state, and they glowed softly like night lights beside the furry meridian pups who twitched their ears in dreams. Species that had been enemies for thousands of years were sleeping side by side, and their children did not know about the wars and did not care about the politics, and they just knew that they were warm and safe and not alone. In the center of this impossible scene sat James Chen, and he had a datapad in his hands, and he was reading something quietly to himself. And when the security teams burst in with their weapons, he simply looked up and raised a finger to his lips. The universal gesture for silence. The soldiers did not know what to do, and they had been prepared for combat and prepared for horror, and they were not prepared for this, and some of them lowered their weapons, and some of them just stared. Commander Rilix pushed through the crowd, and her silver body flickered with confusion as she tried to process what she was seeing. And she opened her mouth to demand answers, but James shook his head. He pointed at the sleeping children, and his message was clear, and whatever questions there were could wait, because right now the cubs needed to sleep behind the commander. The parents began to arrive, and Ambassador Vorthal pushed past the guards, and his eyes found his daughter immediately, and she was sleeping with her head on the belly of a meridian pup, and she looked peaceful and happy. Vorthal fell to his knees, and for a moment he forgot that he was an ambassador, and forgot that he was a warrior, and forgot everything except that his child was safe. Chief Medical Officer Kessath found her 4 children scattered among the group, and they were tangled up with Krethian hatchlings and silicate younglings, and she made a sound that the translator rendered as overwhelming relief. The parents wanted to rush forward and grab their children and hold them tight, but James held up his hand and spoke in a whisper that somehow carried through the room. He asked them to wait, and he said the children had only just fallen asleep, and they had been so tired and so scared for so long, and they needed this rest more than anything. And somehow the parents listened, and somehow they held back, and they stood at the edges of the room and watched their children sleep in safety. Marcus Webb and Amara Okonkwo stood with the crowd, and they looked at their colleague with new eyes, because they had not known what James was planning, and they had not known he was capable of this. James looked back at them and shrugged, as if this was nothing special, and as if any human would have done the same thing. The children slept on, and the adults waited, and for the first time in hours there was peace on the station called Harmony Rest. But questions were coming, and James knew he would have to answer them, and he was not sure if the aliens would understand. The children woke slowly, and their parents were allowed to come forward, and there were tears and embraces and sounds of joy in 17 different languages, and the old hydroponics bay became a place of reunion. But once the children were safe in their parents' arms, the questions began, and everyone turned to look at James Chun, who stood alone in the middle of the room. Commander Rilix approached him, and her silver body vibrated with controlled anger, and she asked him to explain what he had done and why he had caused so much fear and pain. James took a deep breath and looked around at the faces watching him, and some were grateful, and some were furious, and some were simply confused, and he knew he had to make them understand. He said that he had been watching the children for weeks, and he had noticed things that their parents had not noticed, because their parents were too busy with politics and negotiations and ancient grudges. He said the cubs were stressed and frightened and anxious, and they had been having nightmares and refusing food and showing signs of fear that their parents could not see. The tensions between species had been growing worse every day, and the adults argued about trade agreements and territory, disputes and old wars, and they did not realize that their children were absorbing all that fear and hatred. Ambassador Vorthal interrupted and demanded to know how James had gotten the children to come to him and what tricks he had used and what technology he had employed. James smiled sadly and said there were no tricks and no technology, and he had simply asked them. He had talked to the children during meal times and recreation periods, and he had listened to them when nobody else would listen, and they had told him about their nightmares and their fears. He had told them about a human tradition called a sleepover, and he explained that on Earth, children would gather together at night and tell stories and eat snacks and sleep in the same room, and it made scary things less scary. The children had been excited and they had wanted to try it, and James had found the abandoned hydroponics bay and spent weeks preparing it in secret and making it safe for all species. Last night, he had sent a message to each child, and they had snuck out on their own, because children are good at sneaking, and they had come to the bay. And James had been waiting for them. He had given them blankets and cushions, and he had told them stories from Earth, and the stories were about different creatures who became friends, and about fear being conquered, and about monsters who turned out to be lonely and kind. The children had listened with wide eyes, and slowly they had relaxed, and slowly they had moved closer to each other, and by the end of the night, they were sleeping in one big pile with no care for what species they were. Chief Medical Officer Kessath asked why James had not told anyone, and why he had let the parents suffer and search and fear the worst. James was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had made a mistake, and he had not thought about how the adults would react, and he had only been thinking about the children, and he was sorry for the pain he had caused. But he said he was not sorry for what he had done, because the children had needed this, and they had needed to learn that the galaxy was not as scary as their parents made it seem. The room was silent and nobody knew what to say, and some of the parents looked at James with anger, and some looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. A small voice broke the silence, and it was Vorthal's daughter, and she was still holding her father's hand, but she was looking at James. She said that Uncle James had told them the best stories, and she asked if he could tell more stories tonight. The adults did not know whether to arrest James Chun or thank him, and in the end they did neither, and they simply let him go back to his quarters while they figured out what this all meant. But the children remembered, and they had already decided that James was their friend, and children do not forget their friends. In the days that followed, something strange began to happen on the station called Harmony Rest, and it started with the children. Ambassador Vorthal's daughter refused to eat breakfast alone, as she demanded that her Vorn friends join her, and when her father tried to object, she simply stared at him until he gave in. Chief Medical Officer Kessath's 4 children kept asking when Uncle James would come to tell more stories, and they practiced human words and taught them to their Krethian playmates. The Silicate Younglings and the Meridian Pups invented a new game together, and they called it hide and seek, and they played it in the corridors while their parents watched in confusion. The Cubs had decided they were friends now, and they refused to unlearn it, and they dragged their parents into situations that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. A Krethian warrior found himself sitting at a table with Vorn scientists because his daughter wanted to have lunch with her friend, and he could not say no to her eyes. A Meridian pack leader discovered that silicate crystal music was actually quite beautiful, because her pups kept humming the melodies they had learned from their new companions. The children did not understand why their parents had been fighting, and they did not understand ancient grudges and territorial disputes, and they only understood that their friends were their friends, and that was that the adults watched their children and they felt ashamed, and they felt confused, and slowly they began to change. Ambassador Vorthal found himself in a conversation with Chief Medical Officer Kessath, and they talked about their children at first, but then they talked about other things, and they discovered They had more in common than they had thought. Commander Euryalix observed these changes, and she did not understand them, but she recognized their value, and she made a decision. She sat down and wrote a report to the Galactic Coalition Council, and she chose her words carefully because she knew how strange they would sound. She wrote that she recommended further study of human child rearing practices, and she noted that human young were weak and slow to mature and required constant supervision for many years. But she wrote that somehow humans had developed social bonding techniques that transcended species barriers, and one human with a blanket and some stories had accomplished what their diplomats could not achieve in decades. She wrote that the human concept of a sleepover appeared to be a powerful tool for building trust and connection, and she suggested that the coalition might learn from this primitive but effective practice. The report was sent, and it was read by beings who governed thousands of worlds, and they flagged it for study, and eventually they classified it as sensitive information. But classification could not undo what had already happened, and the children of Harmony Rest grew up different from their parents. They grew up knowing that a Krethian could be friends with a Vorn, and that a Meridian could play with a Silicate, and that the universe was less frightening when you faced it together. James Chun continued his work as cultural liaison, and he never received any official recognition for what he had done, and some species still looked at him with suspicion. But he kept a small box in his quarters, and inside the box were 43 gifts, and each gift had been made by a child, and each gift was precious beyond measure. There was a crystal carved by silicate fingers, and a scale shed by a Krethian hatchling, and a tuft of fur from a Meridian pup, and dozens of other treasures that no museum would want, but that James would never give away. Sometimes at night when the station was quiet, James would open the box and look at the gifts and remember the night when 43 children from 17 worlds had fallen asleep listening to his stories, and he would smile because he knew that those children would grow up and they would become ambassadors and commanders and scientists and leaders, and they would remember what they had learned. They would remember that the galaxy is less frightening when you do not face it alone. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The end.